Sarah Martinez stepped off the transport truck at Fort Braxton on her first day as a communications specialist, feeling confident in her pressed uniform and polished boots that reflected the harsh morning sun like mirrors. The three male recruits, lounging near the barracks, immediately noticed the new arrival and exchanged knowing glances as Sergeant Davis pointed her toward the equipment shed with a gruff gesture that suggested he had better things to do than babysit newcomers private. Johnson, the apparent leader of the trio, whispered something to his companions that made them snicker as Sarah walked past carrying her gear with determined steps that echoed across the concrete courtyard. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she struggled with the heavy radio equipment, while the three recruits watched from the shade, making crude comments just loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough to deny if confronted by superior officers. The weight of the communications. Gear pressed into her shoulders as Sarah made her way across the sprawling base, taking in the maze of identical buildings that would become her home. For the next several months, she had trained for this moment through countless hours of physical, conditioning, and technical study, but nothing had prepared her for the immediate hostility that seemed to radiate from certain corners of the base, like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt. The other soldiers she passed offered polite nods, or ignored her completely, but these three seemed to have marked her as prey from the moment her boots hit the ground. Johnson stood about 6 feet tall with the kind of build that suggested he spent more time in the gym than the classroom, and his eyes followed her movement with predatory interest that made her skin crawl. Chen was smaller but wiry with quick movements and a nervous energy that reminded her of a coiled spring waiting to release, while Williams towered over both his companions, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts without effort. The trio had clearly established themselves as the unofficial welcoming committee for new female recruits, and Sarah could sense that this was not their first rodeo. As she approached the equipment shed, the weight of their stares felt heavier than the radio gear strapped to her back, and she could hear their conversation growing more animated, though she could not make out the specific words. The shed itself was a corrugated metal structure that looked like it had seen better decades, with rust stains running down its sides like tears and a door that hung slightly askew on its hinges. The interior would be stifling in this heat, but it contained the specialized communications equipment that would be her responsibility to maintain and operate. Sarah had grown up in a military family where her father had served 3 tours overseas, and her mother had worked as a civilian contractor on various bases. So she understood the unwritten rules and hierarchies that governed military life better than most newcomers. She knew that how she handled these first few encounters would determine her reputation for months to come, and that showing weakness or backing down would only invite more aggressive behavior from those who saw her as an outsider. The communications training she had completed at Fort Gordon had been rigorous and demanding, but it had also been conducted in a controlled environment, where harassment was not tolerated and respect was earned through competence rather than intimidation. Here in the real world of an active military base, the rules seemed different, and the protection offered by instructors and formal protocols felt very far away. Her gear bag contained not just the standard issue equipment, but also personal items that connected her to home, including a photo of her family and a small cross that had belonged to her grandmother. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her almost as heavily as the physical burden she carried, and she knew that failure here would not just affect her own future, but would reflect on every woman who might follow in her footsteps. The 3 recruits had positioned themselves strategically between her and the shed entrance, and she could see that this was no accidental encounter, but a carefully orchestrated test of her resolve. Johnson stepped forward first with a swagger that suggested he was used to getting his way through intimidation rather than merit, and his smile held no warmth, only the cold calculation of someone sizing up potential prey. The base around them continued its normal operations, with vehicles moving between buildings and soldiers going about their duties. But Sarah noticed how the activity seemed to flow around this particular area, as if others instinctively knew to avoid whatever was about to unfold. The isolation was deliberate and complete, creating a pocket of space where normal rules might not apply and where witnesses would be conveniently absent. Her training had covered combat scenarios and technical challenges, but nothing had specifically prepared her for this moment when military discipline met playground bullying. And she would have to navigate the treacherous waters of proving herself worthy of respect without crossing lines that could end her career before it truly began. The equipment she'd loomed ahead like a destination that might as well have been on another continent, given the obstacles that now stood between her and her assigned duties. When Sarah finally made it to the shed door, Private Chen suddenly appeared blocking her path with a twisted smile, asking if she needed help from some real soldiers. And the way he emphasized the word real made it clear that he did not consider her to be a legitimate member of their brotherhood. The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired weapon, and Sarah knew that her response in the next few moments would echo through every remaining day of her service at Fort Braxton. What started as unwanted assistance quickly turned aggressive when Johnson grabbed Sarah's shirt sleeve, claiming he was just trying to help her with the equipment, but his grip tightened as Chen and Williams moved closer, forming a circle around her like wolves closing in on isolated prey. The fabric of her uniform shirt gave way with a loud rip as she tried to pull free, exposing her undershirt. While the three recruits laughed and made lewd remarks about her fitness for military service that echoed off the metal walls of the equipment shed, Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation and rage as other soldiers in the distance seemed to deliberately look away, pretending not to notice what was happening, as if this kind of behavior was so commonplace that intervention would be pointless or dangerous. The torn fabric hung from her shoulder like a battle flag as she realized no one was coming to help. And these three had clearly done this before to other female recruits, based on the practiced way they had isolated her and the casual cruelty in their voices. The moment stretched endlessly as Sarah calculated her options, while Johnson reached for her arm again with that same predatory grin that suggested he was enjoying every second of her discomfort and vulnerability. Chen circled to her left side like a hyena waiting for the alpha to finish with the kill, while Williams positioned himself behind her, cutting off any potential escape route back toward the main base where witnesses might actually intervene. The coordination of their movements spoke to rehearsed tactics, and Sarah understood with crystal clarity that she was not their first victim, but rather the latest in what was probably a long line of female soldiers who had been subjected to this particular form of hazing. The equipment she had been carrying lay scattered in the dirt where she had dropped it when Johnson first grabbed her, and the expensive radio components were now covered in dust and grime that would require hours of cleaning to restore to military standards. The irony was not lost on her that these same men who questioned her competence were now responsible for damaging the very equipment she had been assigned to maintain. Johnson stepped closer, and she could smell the stale coffee on his breath, mixed with something else that might have been chewing tobacco as he leaned in to whisper something that made Chen snicker, and Williams shift his weight from foot to foot in anticipation. The words he spoke were designed to degrade and humiliate, but Sarah found herself focusing instead on the tactical situation and the positioning of her three opponents. The equipment shed behind her offered no refuge as the door was still blocked by Chen, and the interior would only trap her in an even more confined space where their size advantage would be even more pronounced. The open ground around the shed provided room to maneuver, but also meant that any physical confrontation would be visible to anyone who happened to look in their direction. Williams spoke for the first time since the encounter began, and his voice carried a deep rumble that seemed to come from somewhere in his chest, as he suggested that maybe the new girl needed to learn some respect for the soldiers who had been here longer and earned their place through blood and sweat rather than affirmative. Action policies. The accusation stung because Sarah knew she had earned her position through merit and dedication, but she also understood that explaining this to these three would be like trying to reason with a pack of wild animals. The sun continued to beat down mercilessly, and sweat began to form on her forehead, despite the adrenaline that was making her hands shake slightly, as her body prepared for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. Johnson noticed her trembling and mistook it for fear rather than the physiological response of someone whose fight or flight instincts had been fully activated. Chen made a comment about how she looked even prettier when she was scared, and the casual way he said it suggested that intimidating women was something he found genuinely entertaining rather than a necessary evil or a momentary lapse in judgment. The realization that she was dealing with someone who actually enjoyed causing fear and pain made Sarah's blood run cold even as her anger continued to build. The torn shirt flapped in the slight breeze that offered no relief from the oppressive heat, and Sarah became acutely aware of how exposed and vulnerable she appeared to anyone who might be watching from a distance. The three men seemed to feed off her discomfort, and their confidence grew with each passing moment as they realized that no authority figure was going to materialize to put an end to. Thereupon Williams reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife that he began cleaning under his fingernails in a gesture that was clearly meant to be threatening, even though he made no move to point it in her direction. The implicit message was clear enough, and Sarah understood that this situation was escalating beyond simple harassment into something that could have serious physical consequences. Johnson grabbed the torn edge of her shirt and gave it another sharp tug that ripped the fabric further and exposed more of her undershirt, while making a comment about how military uniforms were not designed for people who did not belong in the military in the first place. The physical violation combined with the verbal assault pushed Sarah past the point where she could continue to hope that reason or appeals to their better nature might resolve the situation. Chen stepped even closer, and she could see the anticipation in his eyes as he waited to see how far they could push her before she either broke down completely or tried to fight back against impossible odds. The moment had arrived when Sarah would have to choose between accepting whatever they planned to do to her or taking action that would forever change the trajectory of her military career. The equipment she'd cast a shadow that provided no relief from either the heat or the growing sense that she was completely alone in facing this threat, while the rest of the base continued its normal operations, just a few hundred yards away where help might as well have been on another planet. Sarah's years of martial arts training kicked in as Johnson's hand closed around her wrist, and she twisted sharply, breaking his grip before driving her elbow into his solar plexus, dropping him to his knees, gasping for air like a fish pulled from water. Chen lunged forward thinking she was an easy target, but found himself flat on his back after Sarah swept his legs and followed through with a precise strike. To his pressure point that sent waves of numbness through his entire left side, Williams hesitated for just a moment too long, giving Sarah the opening she needed to grab his extended arm and use his own momentum to send him crashing into the equipment shed wall with a metallic clang that echoed across the courtyard. The three recruits lay groaning in the dirt as Sarah stood over them, breathing hard but victorious, her torn shirt now a symbol of her refusal to be intimidated rather than a mark of vulnerability. However, her moment of triumph was short-lived, as she heard the heavy footsteps of Sergeant Davis approaching at a run, having heard the commotion from his office window where he had been watching the entire encounter unfold. Johnson rolled onto his side, clutching his stomach and trying to suck air back into his lungs, while making sounds that were somewhere between whimpering and cursing. Sarah's elbow strike had been perfectly placed to cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage. But the pain was clearly intense enough to keep him immobilized for several more minutes. Chen attempted to push himself up from the ground, but his left arm refused to cooperate properly, and he fell back down with a grunt of frustration and confusion Williams had taken the worst of it when his head connected with the metal wall of the shed, and a thin trickle of blood ran down from a cut above his eyebrow where the impact had split the skin. The big man sat slumped against the building, looking dazed and disoriented, as if he could not quite understand how someone half his size had managed to put him on the ground so decisively. Sarah's breathing began to slow as the immediate adrenaline rush subsided, but her muscles remained, coiled and ready for action in case any of the three decided to continue the fight. The martial arts training that had started as a childhood hobby recommended by her father had evolved into serious study during her teenage years when she realized that physical confidence would be essential for success in a military career. The techniques she had used were not the flashy moves seen in movies, but rather practical applications of leverage and anatomy designed to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. Her instructors had emphasized that real combat was not about looking impressive, but about ending dangerous situations as rapidly as possible with minimal risk to oneself. Chen finally managed to get to his feet, but his movements were unsteady, and he kept shaking his left hand as if trying to restore feeling to fingers that had gone completely numb. The pressure point strike had been intended to cause temporary paralysis, and it was working exactly as designed, though Sarah knew the effect would wear off within an hour or two. Johnson had progressed from gasping to shallow breathing, but remained curled in a fetal position as waves of nausea washed over him from the solar plexus strike. The human body had several vulnerable points where a precise blow could cause incapacitating pain without permanent injury, and Sarah had spent years learning to target these areas with surgical precision. Williams touched the cut on his forehead and stared at the blood on his fingers, with the expression of someone who had never expected to be on the receiving end of violence. The impact with the shed wall had been the result of his own forward momentum combined with Sarah's redirection, rather than any superhuman strength on her part, but the psychological effect was clearly profound. The scattered radio equipment lay forgotten in the dirt as the four soldiers faced each other in a tableau that would be burned into their memories for years to come. Sarah realized that word of this encounter would spread through the base within hours, and that her reputation would be established based on how she had handled these first few minutes of conflict. Other soldiers had begun to notice the commotion and were starting to drift in their direction, though none had yet approached close enough to intervene or demand explanations. The military culture of minding one's own business unless directly ordered otherwise meant that Sarah had been essentially on her own during the confrontation, but it also meant that there would be witnesses to verify that she had acted in self-defense. Chen made a tentative move toward her, but stopped when Sarah shifted into a defensive stance that made it clear she was prepared to continue the fight if necessary. The message was unmistakable, and he took a step backward while cradling his still numb arm against his chest. Johnson finally managed to push himself up to a sitting position, but the color had not yet returned to his face, and his breathing remained labored. The confidence and swagger that had characterized his approach to the confrontation had evaporated completely, leaving behind someone who looked much younger and far less certain of his place in the world. Williams used the shed wall to pull himself upright, but swayed slightly as if his equilibrium had not fully returned. The cut on his forehead continued to bleed slowly and would probably require medical attention, though it was not serious enough to be life-threatening. Sarah's torn shirt fluttered in the breeze as she maintained her ready position, watching all three men for any sign that they might attempt to resume hostilities. The fabric damage that had started as a symbol of their aggression had been transformed into evidence of her refusal to be victimized. The sound of Sergeant Davis's approaching footsteps grew louder, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her military career would continue or end before it had truly begun. The three men on the ground represented not just individual opponents, but symbols of a system that might not welcome her presence, regardless of her qualifications or determination. Chen looked around desperately as If searching for some way to salvage the situation, or at least avoid the consequences that were clearly approaching with each of the sergeant's heavy steps, Johnson remained focused on his own breathing, while Williams seemed to be trying to process how completely their plan had backfired. The equipment sheet stood as a silent witness to the confrontation that had just unfolded, and Sarah realized that this location would forever be associated in her mind with the moment she had proven to herself, and others that she belonged in this environment regardless of what anyone else might think about her presence. Sergeant Davis surveyed the scene with 3 of his recruits on the ground and the new female soldier standing over them with her shirt torn and her fists still clenched, ready for more. The silence stretched as other soldiers began to gather, drawn by the noise, and Sarah wondered if she had just ended her military career before it began. But Davis surprised everyone by ordering the 3 male recruits to report to his office immediately, while telling Sarah to get a new shirt and report back for duty. His weathered face showed the slightest hint of approval as he walked away, leaving the gathered crowd to disperse and the 3 defeated recruits to limp toward the barracks. Word of the incident spread through the base like wildfire, and by evening, Sarah found herself sitting with a group